Today, we're going to do hypothesis testing on the mean. Last year, we did hypothesis testing on the p. And you saw that every problem, the calculation we did, we used the same formula every time. Okay, different information, same formula. Today, it's the same thing. We're going to give information. We're going to use a formula, and it's going to be the same formula each time. But now we're going to do it with the mean. So it has nothing to do with probability, right? There's no P and Q now. Now it's an X bar and a sigma or an S. By the way, in reality, if you're doing a sample on a population, let's just say we're trying to find, what's the average height of a Mesa College student? Okay, great. So we go out and we measure a bunch of Mesa College students. There's no reason in the world we would know sigma. We wouldn't know Mesa College population's standard deviation. We don't even know Mesa College average. So in real life, you rarely know sigma. So you use S, that's your sample standard deviation. You use S in place of. There are a few exceptions. We know that, for example, we know that human heights are essentially normally distributed. We know that duration of pregnancies are essentially normally distributed. There are certain things we know are normally distributed. Therefore, we have a universal number. But then when I'm looking at Mesa College, I still don't know what Mesa College's standard deviation is. I might know what it is for planet Earth, but might we be a taller society or an older society or a smarter society than the rest of the planet? Sure. We're our own little world in that sense. So that's why you rarely have sigma at your disposal. So you take a big sample and use S. And remember, the bigger the sample, the more trustworthy the information in the sample. That's what the central limit theorem was a few weeks ago. Remember we said the bigger the sample, the tighter the spread's going to be, and the closer it's going to be to the actual population. That's why when samples are large, it's unusual that they are very far from the average. So that makes it easier for us to make conclusions. No, here they are. Now it's well supplied. So in this case, the test statistic we used last day, when we calculated our Z for probability, okay, we used what? Our calculated Z, do you remember? It was P hat minus the assumed value of P, right, from the null hypothesis. And here's the idea. If, Roz says she makes at least 80% of her free throws, then we're going to start with that's absolute fact. And now Roz is going to go out and shoot free throws. And we're going to see if the sample is close to what she says or very far from what she says. But we start with your claim. We have to start with that being the absolute truth. And then the evidence needs to show it otherwise. Does that make sense? Good morning, Junior, except now you are my screen. So hold on a minute. And let me do myself now. Here we go. Okay. So we put this over what? Remember, it was the square root of P, Q over N. And that's the same P. So the idea being, if whatever you're saying, we're going to start with that being the truth. We're going to assume you're not guilty. And so we're going to assume this is true, and that this is true, and that this is true, and we know what N is. And now that's the only wild card in there. That's our measurement. That's our sample. That says, okay, if this is really far away, if this produces a really big number positively or negatively, now we have doubts. This is where the court of law comes in. Does the evidence tell a different story, or does it confirm what you're saying? And that's what we did. Okay, that was when we did the P. Today we're doing a test on mu. Uh-oh. Oh, hold on. I don't like using the nasty rags. Well, because they're nasty. So now we're going to do it on mu. Population mean, that is, right? We're going to test this guy. So now our Z, our measured Z is going to be, and I'll explain what's going on here. And then, of course, this would be either, well, sorry, I was going to say square root of S squared. We'll just write it as S. I'll put or sigma. It's the standard deviation, but remember, it's very unlikely we know sigma, so it's probably S. Does everybody understand? In terms of the formulas, that we treat them as interchangeably because it's the only number we have. So same thing. whatever the null hypothesis is, we're going to assume that's the absolute fact. That's the mu. And then we measure this, we know the sample size. And again, this is the wild card right here. This is what we went out and measured. This is our sample. How far away is the sample from what we're assuming is the truth? If it's too far away, got it? Same thing. So keep it really simple. I'm going to go buy a bunch of lumber, okay? And this is not a weird thing because my house has been under construction. We literally have just finished in the last few days an 8-month remodel. And they have to buy wood, they have to buy all sorts of things. We gutted our downstairs, put a new kitchen. It's been incredible. And I was going to retire in 2 years. That's not a joke. Now I'm probably not. I'm probably 2 years from May has been my target date for many, many years. Now it's probably going to be a little bit longer because of the amount we've taken on. But I want to buy a whole bunch of lumber at Home Depot, let's say. Okay, so I'm going to buy a whole bunch of 6 foot, boards. Are they all going to be exactly 6 feet? No. I'm hoping they're 6 feet. But is it possible they're too long or too short? Yeah. So if we buy a whole bunch of wood and I stack them up, is it possible I'm going to see the ends differ a little bit? Mm-hmm. So here's the question I have, because by the way, if they're too long, is that okay? Yes. Because I can always shave them. Yeah. If they're too short, is that okay? No. All the putty in the world isn't going to make it a longer piece of wood. Oh, so here's the thing. All right. So here's really, is the 6 foot board at Home Depot actually 6 feet? Do we agree that it would be okay to be longer than 6 feet? Yes. Do we agree that it would be bad to be shorter than 6 feet? Yeah. Now, if it was a quarter of an inch or a half an inch shorter than 6 foot, an inch shorter, probably not going to work. Okay, and I know this because they had to do things with our ceiling. They had to put in what are called strong walls. We had 3 6 by 6 by 6 foot holes in our downstairs at one point that they had to then fill with cement. The idea being we want to keep the upstairs, gigantical things to, but a lot of these, they had at one point, it was open, and then the next day it'd be framing. You'd see framing everywhere. It looked like basically a jail. You said we'd take a lot of pictures of us, looking like a jail cell, with all the vertical pieces of wood. But there was a lot of pieces of wood that they had to put little shims under. You know what a shim is? Just something, a little bit of extra, because the piece of wood didn't reach the ceiling or didn't reach the cross. It's like, that's bad. And so, we just put a little shim in there. We put something in there so it now is tight. Because again, you don't want any slack when you got an upstairs that's resting on something. So this is the question, okay? We have to set up a problem, and then we're gonna set up the sample. And like I said last day, you will assume that the sample information will be handed to you. But in reality, who's doing the sample? You are, yeah, you're the statistician. You said, okay, here's my staff, go out and buy 100 pieces of lumber and measure every single one of them. And then we will calculate the mean and the standard deviation of what you measured, and now we have something to test. But you have to understand how easy that part is in reality. To buy wood and measure it, that's not complicated. But you're going to have somebody do that, and then they're going to hand you, okay, Ms. Newman, this is what we got. Here's our X bar, here's our S. Now we're going to perform the problem. So our null hypothesis, our alternative hypothesis. Now let's think about it. If being bigger than 6 feet is okay, then our null hypothesis should be that the true mean is either equal, greater than, less than, greater than, equal, less than, equal. Oh gosh, which is it? Well, if we said being smaller is bad, equal is good, and bigger than equal is good, then this probably should be greater than or equal, shouldn't it? Because remember, the null has to include the equal. The alternative is, think of that as the guilty verdict. What would we consider to be bad in this case? Well, be too short. Now, do I want to use 6 feet? Because when you measure that wood, are you going to measure it in decimal amounts of feet, or you're probably going to measure it in inches? Because when we say we're off by a fraction of an inch, so would it make sense to say 72 inches? It would probably make more sense. Do you agree? And then our alternative would be that it is less than, because remember, between the two of these, they got to cover everything. The null hypothesis absolutely is equal, greater than or equal, less than or equal, because each of those includes the equal. In this case, it's greater than or equal because being too long is okay. We're okay with it being too long. That's not a problem. Being too small is a bad thing. Okay. Let's say we want to test at the alpha equal 0.05 level of significance. That means we're going to look up our magic number. That means we're looking up the Z that has exactly a 5% tail. Well, not in the Z table, look at the magic numbers on the formula sheet.
Oh.
Remember, there's 4 magic numbers. There's the 5%, the 1%, the 2.5%, and the 0.5%. 1.645. Beautiful. So I will reject the null hypothesis if my measured value of Z is, oh, do I want it bigger than this? This is where we'll draw a picture. I'm a big fan of the picture. Okay. This would be perfection. A Z-score of 0 means that our sample came in exactly what we were supposed to. Does that happen very often? Probably not. We have a lot of wiggle room. Understand, a Z-score of 0 means your sample mean is equal to the population mean. It means when you were shooting free throws, your sample free throws percentage was exactly the same as your claim free throws. In real life, it's probably not going to equal 0, but in real life, we'd say, you know what? If our null is valid, then it should be ridiculously close. What are we saying is bad? Too big or too small?
It's too small.
So we're going to reject in the left tail. Oh, that means we're going to reject for a negative Z, not a positive Z. So we will reject if our measured Z is what? Smaller than negative 1.645. Don't say less than positive 1.645 because positive 1.645 is at this end. So remember, if I say less than this, then I'm rejecting almost all outcomes, aren't I? I'd be going almost the whole curve. No, I only want to reject, in simple English, I only want to reject the tail. I only want to reject the extremes.
Still a question. Because you said less than, that means automatically you're going to go to
left tail. Exactly. And where does that come from? That comes from this.
Yes.
So the order of things, always draw the picture that corresponds with this. Okay, bad would be too small. Too small means left tail. If bad was too big, then it's right tail. That's it. So when I'm saying what will cause me to reject the null hypothesis, a big negative will cause me to reject the null hypothesis. Not a big positive. A big positive is good. That means they're giving me extra wood. Now, bad for Home Depot, good for me. Okay, but it'd be like saying when you're buying your 10-pound bag of potatoes and they always come out 11 pounds, you're not going to complain. But if your 10-pound bag of potatoes only came out 9 pounds, yeah, you're going to complain. Just remember that bad usually is only in one direction in reality. So the reason we do this for our own self, so we know which way we're rejecting. And when I state it, I'm rejecting the extreme, but the extreme to the left, not the extreme to the right. Okay. You're the statistician. You do all of this before you collect the sample. The mistake some people make is they collect the sample, do all the stuff, and then try to come up with a hypothesis. And it doesn't work that way. We're police officers. Let's just go out and does that feel a little backwards? Is it? Somebody had to be accused of the crime. Now let's collect the evidence to see. Yeah. You kind of don't do it the other way around. Okay, so the evidence is that you went out and did a sample. Let's keep it really simple. So you went out and you collected a sample, let's say of size, let's make it big. You bought 87 pieces of wood. Random number. Your X bar was 71.3 inches. Your standard deviation was 0.81. By the way, the standard deviation should really be small. If my standard deviation was large, that means my pieces of wood are all over the map. My standard deviation is less than an inch. An inch would still be a lot of variation. Do you agree? because that means on average, every piece of wood is off. And by the way, the standard deviation means it could be off too big or too small. It just means it's off. It's like, I missed the target by that much. So this is what we hired our staff. All right. So Andrew had the staff, and they went out and bought 87 pieces of wood. You paid for it, of course. And then you had them simply measure each one accurately, find the average of those 87 pieces of wood, and so on. Okay. Can we now calculate our Z based on that? Yes. You're not going to calculate these. We're going to, in reality, collected the data. Somebody else handed you this on a piece of paper and said, okay, here's our data. Because the statistician's not going to go out there and add them all up, right? That's your underlings are going to do that. So you trust that information is accurate. Now we need to calculate a Z-score. And I showed you before, let's see, I want to make sure this stays on the screen. So our calculated Z is, it's X bar minus mu. Remember, we're starting by saying, what do we now? We're going to assume as absolute fact that the wood is 72 inches long. We're going to let the evidence tell us otherwise. What are we starting with absolute fact in the football game? That the call on the field was correct. And then what do? We review it and see if the evidence makes us change our mind. You guys understand that's, if you watch sports, they use the exact same thing that we're doing. In a court of law, it's the exact same thing we're doing. We start with what are we considering the absolute truth before we start? Not guilty. The call on the field, what we're measuring here. All of these we start as being the truth, and then we say, now we have evidence that may make us change our mind. We don't know yet. We have to do the calculation. So what goes on top? X bar minus mean that we're claiming over, whoops, I put in too big of a square, sorry, over S over the square root of 87. Now, I would suggest using a parentheses T on the top and on the bottom because I need to finish my numerator and I need to finish my denominator. So when you're entering this from left to right, here's what I would suggest, because you can do this in one sweep. 71.3 minus 72 close. Now your numerator is done. Divided by 0.81 divided by the square root of 87 close. Now your denominator is done. But if I don't use parentheses, my calculator is going to do something different, because if I don't use parentheses, I won't actually be doing that. So let's all do that. Again, I have extra calculators as always. Now that's kind of important. Yeah, that one. Not random. So 71.3 minus 72. Tell me what you get. Negative 8.2. Okay, that's a Z value. Okay, we said if our calculated Z is smaller than negative 1.645, we would say that's just a little too far off. So this is the reality. We're hoping for this. We'll reject here. Where is our outcome? About right here.
Sorry, what did you get for the answer?
Negative 8.06.
By the way, there's no other way. You kind of have to do that. Now, can you complete your numerator, hit equals, and then do the rest? Yes, but if you don't do your denominator in parentheses, you're going to end up doing something goofy with the square root. Okay, so our evidence kind of came out almost in the next room. Does that make it easy to make a conclusion? you can't, by the way, nothing's going to be this easy in real life. It's kind of easy. If we're going to reject for anything in the tail, and last I talked about, you're in here, on the other side of this door is the shark infested lava. That's what you're going to reject. It's not a question of degree. Now, where did you land? You landed about 10 miles out into the shark infested lava. You're pretty much going to reject this, aren't you? Because you're kind of extreme. Say again?
We already fallen into the lava.
Yeah, you're like rocket launched way out there into the lava. It's not would you say this is not a close call? This is not a close call. So what is your conclusion? And I'll write it out in words. Since negative 8.06 is in fact less than negative 1.645 by quite a bit. Remember, that's a z-score. You are going to reject the null hypothesis. Okay, this is about as easy of a guilty verdict as you're going to get, right? You're going to reject not guilty. So always state your final conclusion in words. You're going to reject the null hypothesis, so therefore what are you going to state is the truth? That the average length of the boards is less than 72. That's a no-brainer. Now, you're Home Depot, and there's a problem. If I'm buying planks of wood, and I come back and said, you know, I just bought all these wood, and most of them are too short, and I can't work with these because they're too short. And I bring them back. Home Depot is not going to accuse me of shaving off the last half inch or inch. That I don't think anybody's going to do that, because why? I bought these. I went home and I altered them and I took them back to get my money back. Well, don't I still have to buy new ones then? In other words, I've still spent the same amount of money. People don't do that. People might try to get freebies. People aren't going to buy something, take it back after they've altered it just to get different ones. So I took it back and Home Depot says, oh, you're right. Everyone's like a quarter inch, half inch, some are an inch short. They've got to replace them. They don't have a choice. That's the law. So Home Depot's out a lot of money if they're shorting people, aren't they? They're out a lot of money because they got to replace them. So therefore, what do they need to do? They need to change the way. By the way, Home Depot is not guilty. I'm just using them as an example because that's where we all get our wood from. But they would say, you know, we need to be more on the ball when we're actually cutting these. Maybe there's a flaw in the way we're cutting them. Maybe our measurement system is flawed. You know, it's Robert set up our system. He goes, I think 6 feet is about right there. Okay, I'm not going to use a ruler. I'm really good. I think 6 feet is about right there. Okay.
Finally, I got the right answer. Sorry.
That's all right. We got it. We got to get it eventually.
Yeah.
So here's an easy one. Things aren't always this easy. Now, remember the p-value? The p-value is, if this is the truth, then how likely is this result? Well, on your Z table only goes to negative 3.5, doesn't it? And this is negative 8. So it says on your Z table, if you're past 3.5, what you would actually say is the p-value is less than, you can just use words, 0.001. If you could actually do this on a computer, it'd probably be like 20 zeros. It would be, why? Because a Z-score beyond 3 is unusual. A Z-score beyond 4 is almost impossible. A Z-score beyond 8, no, ain't gonna happen. In other words, if this was the truth, this would be like 1 in a trillion. You could have an average be that. It's impossible. Okay, so that means no. I'm pretty comfortable with that conclusion. All right, does that make sense? Now, was this calculation very similar to what we did last time? Yeah. I took the evidence, I threw it into a calculation, calculated a Z, made my conclusion. The part I wanted you to see the most is we set up the whole problem. We set up the null alternate hypothesis, the criteria for rejection, before we actually get information. Now, when I'm asking you the questions, I'm going to give you the information with the question. But the reality is you always do things in a certain order. Now, the thing is, what if these numbers made this very close? This is a question that's always tough. Let's suppose I changed something about the problem. Maybe I made my sample much smaller. What happened if my Z was here on this side? Now, if that's the shark-infested lava over there, that's kind of like saying, Destiny took a running start. She's running towards the shark-infested lava and you put her on the brakes and stop just before. Is she in the shark-infested lava? No. Therefore, you cannot reject. But it's so close. In a court of law, that's like saying they're almost guilty. We still have to say not guilty. We don't say innocent. We just can't say guilt because they didn't cross the threshold. If you're right here, then your conclusion is fail to reject the null, not enough evidence. Now, what if all I needed was a bigger sample? Well, in a court of law, again, I use this analogy because it's exactly the same as the stats. In a court of law, You did everything right. The attorneys did everything right. And 11 of the 12 jurors, remember, a jury selection technically is considered a random sample. And it is, because if you've ever been in the jury selection process, you realize they question every single juror to make sure there is absolutely no bias. Because if there's bias, then it's not fair. And by the way, if it was you on trial or a family member, you'd say, no, I want an unbiased jury of my peers. And that's another one that's a little bit tricky. We'll get into that later. We say unbiased jury of my peers. You guys remember Rodney King? Were any of you alive?
Yes.
You were alive. I remember Rodney King. Rodney King was the guy, he was basically beaten by LAPD. And then they had a trial and they were found not guilty. Rodney King was black, the police officers were white, and it was caught on video. He hadn't actually done anything. Now, I had a friend who was a police officer at the time and said, yeah, but you don't know what a bad guy this was and what a record he had. But he was a bad guy, but he hadn't done anything on that day. The police beat him, they beat him up, and it was on video. It was the first time anything like that had happened. When the not guilty verdict came in, there were riots. I mean, I saw a video of a truck driver getting pulled out of his truck and beaten because people were so upset. Now, that was wrong. You can't riot in the streets. They said, well, why was there riots? They found him not guilty. The black man beaten by the white cops was tried by a jury of 12 white folks. Is that a jury of your peers?
No.
Is that even a representation of Los Angeles in general? No. So do you suppose there may have been a little bit of bias, even though they, did you see the problem with that? It's like, wait a minute. There was never going to be a chance that they were going to be found guilty. There was never. Now, fast forward, okay? George Floyd. I want to say George Floyd. Very similar situation. He's been, he was killed. You guys, that's cause of all. They tried the officer and they found him guilty because he was actually tried before a jury of his peers. They did not load the jury with basically people who were not going to vote guilty. No, it was not that long. There was worry that if he was found not guilty, that we would have the same situation with riots, and they were probably right, because the Rodney King situation outside of California, in fact, outside of Southern California, most of the world wasn't that into it. This is way before social media and things like that. In Southern California, it was huge, but I knew people in other states had never even heard of the situation. They never heard of the riots. But George Floyd, the whole world knew. Social media is a little different now, isn't it? I mean, and so this time, I believe they got it right. It's not about black and white. It's about bias versus unbiased, getting it right. Because if the person truly was not guilty, they should be found not guilty. So going back to the court of law, everything is done right on both sides. Non-biased jury, on and on and on. 11 of the jurors vote guilty. 1 votes not guilty. You do not convict. You don't let them free. That's called a mistrial. Sometimes it's referred to as a hung jury. They didn't come up with a conclusion. So you have 2 options. You have a retrial with a new jury, or you have to acquit. You have to let them go. Now, here's the interesting thing. Say, well, if they have all this evidence and they think they did it, why don't they just retry? Well, think of statistically speaking. I went out, collected a sample, I got a certain conclusion. And if I did my sampling right, then if I do the same process again, shouldn't I come to the same conclusion because I'm sampling from the same population? In other words, the idea of when I take a random unbiased sample, my samples really should look really similar. Agreed? So the idea with the court of law, if an unbiased selection of 12 people couldn't convict them, then the next group of 12 probably won't convict them either. And the next group of 12 probably won't convict them either. So therefore, we're probably going to let them go, because realistically, if we couldn't get 12 for 12 with this group, we're probably not going to get 12 for 12 with the next group. So most of the time they declare a mistrial, because they're saying, if I do this experiment over and over and over again, I really should see the same results each time I do it. The exception is if it's really, really, really important. You're talking about, like somebody's the head of a cartel, so somebody really big and famous, and maybe we're thinking, okay, maybe they got to the jury. That you see that in movies all the time, We will retry in that situation, but a lot of times we don't retry because of the cost and the time. And it's a fundamental right. You will have the right to a speedy trial and all that kind of stuff. So the interesting thing about the court of law is if you fail to reject, you usually stop and walk away. You don't get to say, let me change the situation, because that's kind of cheating. I'm going to keep doing it until I reject. I'm going to keep doing this experiment until I reject. Well, no, because you really ought to come up with the same conclusion. So let's try another one, okay? So, here's the thing. I do a lot of shopping at Sprouts. I don't buy a lot of pre-bagged stuff. You know, I buy my potatoes, I usually just buy them. But I do buy some things that are pre-bagged. You know, and it says 5 pounds on the bag. You guys with me? It says exactly how much it is. And I was have fun with it. That's really should put that way, because you can't legally make a text inside a classroom in the state of California, outside of it. Yeah. That's been a law, oh my God, since 1990. You know, if you guys were in a high school classroom and you started texting, you're not only is the phone confiscated, but you risk expulsion. Yeah, that hasn't changed in 30 years. Yeah, by the way, it was automatic expulsion until Columbine. They changed the rule. Now they say, by the way, the language, the official language is you can only place a call or make a text inside a California classroom. It says terrorist threat. I rather they just use the words emergency. You know, if I fall down and have a heart attack, you're supposed to use all those buttons and no one knows how to do it. No, I want you to call 911 on your phone. You can't control receiving a call or a text. So you're not guilty. You just want to turn it off. But you can't in the middle of a class start calling and texting. No, you go outside to do that. And I have students who sit there in the front row every day and they're playing, and then they'll ask the question that I've just spent 15 minutes explaining because they weren't paying attention. I'm not going to bother answering it. I usually just turn around and say, like that, like the entire board. Oh, I didn't notice. You know, I have a student, he's watching videos and he's laughing while I'm lecturing. I said, really, can you do that back at the preschool where you just hung out? It's a calculus student, the only one in the class who's failing, and he watches videos in the front row and laughs. And I'm thinking, why are you in college? Really? What, you're watching videos during a calculus lecture of which you have no idea what's going on, and you're actually making noise that the people around him want to just, you know, pop them over the head. So we have the 5 pound bag of potatoes. My new favorite thing is I buy these little potatoes, and I learned how to make smooshed potatoes recently. You guys know what those are?
Is that what those like little ball ones?
That's what you, well, no, it actually took me several tries. We were at Stone, which is my wife's favorite place, and I'm looking at the menu, smooshed potatoes. I'm thinking mashed potatoes. No. They're the little potatoes, and they're basically smooshed like with the potato masher, and they're, you know, salted and they got oils. They're yummy. So I asked the guy, I go, how do you make them? He goes, well, you boil them, bring them to boil, but don't cook them all the way through, and then cool them down with cold water. And then the first few times I made them, I didn't cook them long enough. They just didn't work. So now I've got it down. I know when I can poke about halfway through with a knife. You take them off, drain the hot water, fill with cold water, drain that, fill with cold water again. You got to bring the temperature way down. Then you spread them out in the pan, and you get your potato masher, which I have, and you press them about halfway down. And if they're perfect, not a lot of the potato will stick to the potato masher. If a lot of potatoes sticking, that means you didn't cook them long enough. Then I drizzle olive oil all over the top of them. Ooh. And then a little salt. You put them in the oven. It's heavenly, but it took me a few tries. So I've been buying these bags of the little potatoes. Yes. My point is the bags say exactly how much they weigh. Mm-hmm. When you're buying a bag of anything at a grocery store, is it even mathematically possible for it to be exactly that weight? Way. No, because
there's no way.
Because all potatoes are not the same size. Oh, so if I wanted to get it to exactly 5 pounds, then I'm almost at 5 pounds. Won't I have to have a partial potato? Do you guys see what I'm getting at? Yeah. Oh, therefore every bag is either going to be a little more or a little less. So when I buy groceries for my parents. So when they ask me to buy that 3 pound or 5 pound bag of oranges, I don't just grab one, I weigh it. I only buy the ones that are more than they say. I never buy the ones that are less than they say, and they're never going to be exactly. So here's the thing. We run the produce department at Sprouts, and we'd really like to know if our 5 pound bags of potatoes actually weigh 5 pounds. Forget that you already have a good idea what it probably is. All right? So, question, do the 5-pound bag of potatoes actually weigh 5 pounds? Does everybody understand? Not only is that a reasonable question, if you go grocery shopping, by the way, how many ever buy bagged stuff? Do you weigh it first?
No.
You should,
I don't.
because you might grab the one that was a little short.
I still do.
But see, wouldn't you rather have an extra potato?
True.
I would. And if I'm gonna pay the same for the bag that's too short as the one that's extra, I'm buying the one that's extra every time, because I know it's impossible. Now, we'd say, this is not a situation where I say, well, if you give me too much, that's okay. No, I'm the store manager. I don't want to give you too much because then I'm throwing it away. I don't want to give you too little because then you might come back and say, hey, you shorted me. But that probably should have weighed the bag. But so really it comes down to this. What if all the customers are smart and they all weigh the bags? Then I'm not going to sell any of the ones that are short, am I? You got the 5-pound bag, but this one's only 4.5. This one's 4 3/4. They're not going to get sold because you're smart enough to weigh the bag. You're going to buy the other one. So it's one thing to say, well, I would have to replace it if it's too small. This is worse. I'm not even selling it if it's too short. Oh, I'm not even selling it. If you went into the store and you're going to buy a bag of chips and you went back, buy your bag of chips and you saw it was already partially open, are you buying that bag? No. My son works at Trader Joe's. Eggs. You might buy eggs? Most people buy their eggs at Trader Joe's. What should you always do before you buy your eggs? Open it up, check them. And a high percentage of those will have a broken egg, a cracked egg. So you just keep going, okay. And I take my fingers, I kind of run them down, make sure. Do you know they can't sell the ones with the broken egg? They have to donate. They cannot sell them, so they donate them. But they donate, my son said that probably 1/3 of all the eggs get donated. 1/3. Because you can, wait a minute, can't you just swap out? That's what I would do.
Yeah.
No, they legally can't do that. I find that odd. Wow. If I have 10 cartons of eggs, each one with 1 broken egg, why not take the broken eggs, put them all in the same one?
The whole carton they donate?
The whole carton of 12 has to be donated.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's across the board. They cannot sell it. I don't understand why they can't sell it. So for the store, let's suppose all of us are smart enough to weigh our bags of potatoes. They're not even going to sell the ones that are way short. Now, if it's 4.99 pounds, do you have an issue with that? No. But if it's 4.5 pounds, yeah, that's way too far off. So I'm running the store and I would really like to know, am I on the button? I know it's not going to be perfect, but is it so close? Like the coin flip, is it so close to being perfect heads and tails? Because otherwise I may have to get a new supplier because I'm losing money. If they're too big, I'm giving it away. If it's too small, I'm not selling them. Ooh. So let's say let's use 0.1 this time. At the 0.1 level of significance, that's the same as saying the 1% level of significance. Test whether the bags are 5 pounds or not. Say again? This is an equal versus a not equal. Because in this scenario, as a customer, you're totally okay with too much. But I'm the store manager, I'm not okay with too much because again, it means I'm giving it away. So it either is or it is not. Question?
Never mind, I just answered my own question. I was going to ask.
Love those kind of questions.
From the
Still answering, sir. From the
other example, the one
previously,
you used actually as the question said actually 60.
Right, but we said, well, when I'm buying that wood, here's the customer. I'm buying the wood. I'm okay with it being too long. I can't have it be too short because I can't use it. So too long was okay. So that's one of those at least. Remember we talked about implied inequalities? You can miss 6 questions on your driving test. You can also miss less than 6. You just can't miss more than 6. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And of course, the most painful one for most guys, who especially were late bloomers. Remember the cardboard clown? You must be this tall. Robert was always that tall, but Salvador, were you always that tall? Remember that one? You must be this tall to ride the ride. You know, you're a junior high boy who hasn't started sprouting and you're probably not tall enough to ride the ride, but all the girls are because they stopped growing by junior high. You're laughing. No, both of my sons were not tall enough to ride the ride. Now they're much taller than me, but they were very late bloomers. I laugh. When it says you must be this tall to ride the ride, and Robert says, but I'm taller than that. Isn't it implied you must be at least this tall? That's what we talk about, the implied inequality. You know, when you go to the grocery store, $20, do you have to spend equal to 20? No, you can spend at most 20, so 20 or less.
That's the difference, because on the other one you asked at least, and this one you're asking.
I'm saying, I'm the manager now. I need to know, are they exactly 5 pounds or not? Because again, I used an analogy last day of a scale. When I get on the scale, I'm not happy if it weighs me too heavy. I'm not happy if it weighs me too light. I don't say I want to, no, I want to know, is it accurate? Is it not accurate? If it's too heavy or too light, it's not good. So if it's too big or too small, it's not good. So how do I set up my null and alternative? My null hypothesis is what? That the mean equals 5. And the alternative is the mean is not equal to 5. Now I said 0.01. Careful. What's going to cause rejection? Too small
or too big.
Or too big. Oh, so that's when I split it in half. So I'm not looking up the 0.01, I'm looking up the 0.005 because it's 0.05 plus 0.005 is 0.1. Remember, on a two-tailed test, the total tail probability has to be whatever it was. In this case, 0.01. The total tail probability, that means each tail is 0.005. Oh, that's why I draw the picture. The 0.01, the 2.326 z value is if all 1% is in one tail. Okay. But our 1% is split between two tails. So which number do we use here? 2.576. Hence, the importance of drawing the correct picture. You never have to, but you always should. Again, because what does it mean? It means 0.5% is in this tail, 0.5% is in this tail. So my total tail probability is 0.001, but that gives me a different z than if all the 1% was in one tail. That's why a two-tailed test is slightly different. Okay, so I will reject. Now, so we look up the magic number. We stated the null and alternative based on the situation. This is not an opinion. It's just the situation says this is what I should do. I found the magic number. Now I'm going to, it's called stating the criteria for rejecting. So we don't want to use good language here. So I will reject the null hypothesis if, now I have two statements, don't I? I want to say either one. So if my measured z is smaller than something, or my measured z is bigger than something. So to help myself, that's 2.576. And what's that one? Negative 2.576. Oh, so I reject if I'm that way, which is less than the negative, or I'm that way, which is greater than the positive. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. There's no calculation there. I'm just stating it. But by drawing the picture, I'm far more likely. What's the danger? If I have the inequalities going the wrong way, then I'm going to reject all outcomes. I'm going to reject the bulk. No, I only want, in simple English, you only want to reject extremes. In this case, there's two extremes. Too big or too small, we consider bad. Okay? You with me on it? Yeah. So now, you're the statistician. This is easy. You're going to go buy sprouts and buy a whole bunch of bags of potatoes. You're going to weigh them, and you're going to make your conclusions. Does that sound reasonable? Mm-hmm. So I'm going to go ahead and erase this because I need the space. So you went by, or you had your underlings do it. This is kind of easy. I just go buy all the ones that are there. You went by. Let's say you collected 45 bags. Your X bar was 50.1 pounds, and your standard deviation was 0.25 pounds. And by, I'm sorry, 5.1, not 50.1, sorry.
45 is 45 pounds.
45 bags, I weighed them. The average was 5.1 and the standard deviation was 0.25. And that small standard deviation makes sense because it's not that heavy. Okay. Now let's calculate our z-value. Now everybody gets all nervous. I gotta use a calculator. No, I'm happy because I don't have to do it in my head. I'm not afraid of my calculator. And neither should you. All right, so Z star is X bar minus, what are we calling the truth? That mu is 5. Over S divided by the square root of n. What? Oh, you got a number. What do you got?
2.683.
Okay, does anyone else get that? 2.68? So approximately 2.68. So what does that mean? Well, if I go back to my picture, we said we were going to reject if it was more negative than negative 2.576 or more positive than positive 2.576. Where does our result fall? Just barely in here, doesn't it? In other words, Destiny had a full head of steam. She's going, she wanted to stop, but she fell in. But she fell in. And it's not a question of degree when you fall in the shark-infested lava, is there?
Yeah.
So whether you barely fall in or whether you're shot out 100 miles here, if I'm in the rejection zone, think of this as the shark-infested lava. I'm in the shark-infested lava. Barely, mind you, but I'm still in. So what's your conclusion going to be?
Reject.
You're going to reject the null. So what is your conclusion? Rejecting the null tells you now how, question? Did you not get that?
Okay, so I'm right there. We got 2.68.
So where does that put you?
That puts me
Barely, but in the rejection
barely,
zone, but you're in the shark-infested lava.
We still reject it.
Yes,
because
it's not a question of degree. You don't say somebody's barely guilty. They're guilty or they're not guilty. I reject or I don't. And by the way, I did this on purpose. I made it a close call. And a lot of times people don't know what to do with a close call. No. If I'm in the shark-infested lava, I'm in the shark-infested lava. That's it. Again, it's not a question, but she almost didn't fall in. But she fell in. In the previous example, it was so extreme that we were rocket launched, but it's still a reject. So you're going to reject the null. Now you're going to hold your press conference later on today. We rejected the null hypothesis because the data suggested that the null was not correct, and we're going to come up with the alternative hypothesis to conclude. What? No, what are you going to say? The mean or the bags, let's say. The bags are not 5 pounds each. That's it. Simple English. But they were only 5.1 though. But because the standard deviation was so small, that means that the bags in general are always going to be enough off that I'm still going to lose money. Now, am I going to lose a lot of money? 5.1. I'm Costco now. I sell 1 million of these bags. Am I going to lose? Now all of a sudden, yeah, I'm going to lose some money because the sheer number of things I sell. If does anybody go to Costco? What do you buy? Yeah, regularly.
Well, protein.
Okay, you buy your protein. What if they lost 5 cents every time they sold the protein powder? You said, well, it's 5 cents. But if they're selling, 50 million of them a year, oh, that's millions of dollars that we are losing. That's one thing that losing is losing. You're saying, well, why am I only using one bag? Well, think of it as a large number of bags. Yes.
So for example, if we change such a small amount of X bar or something.
Okay, you're out asking the perfect question. That's exactly what I want you to look at next. So we went out and collected the data. what if we collected the data, we got that. We collected the data, we got that, but we did a bit smaller of a sample. In other words, is it reasonable, based on our data, is it reasonable, this is the court of law idea, that regardless of how I collected my sample, isn't it reasonable that these numbers should always show up or something really close to them if I did it right? If I did it right, whether I collected 10,000 or 10, I really should be seeing these numbers over and over again if I did it right. But if I collected a smaller sample, let me just for fun, let's change our sample size. Everybody change your sample size to 35 and do the same problem. Change your sample size to 35. What would you have gotten?
2.36.
You would have gotten 2.36. That's interesting because where does 2.36 fall?
Okay.
In formal mathematical terms, it falls shy of the shark-infested lava. So in other words, as Destiny was running, she was able to put on the brakes in time and not go in. What would your conclusion have been? And by the way, Lila, that was absolutely the right question to ask. What would your conclusion have been if this were the situation? You would have said fail to reject. There's not enough evidence to make that conclusion. Ooh, this is the power of a large sample. I want to make the right conclusion, but sometimes let's have some fun. Let's suppose these bags of potatoes are special. They're really special. They're grown in some, unusual tropical environment. In other words, these 5-pound bags cost like $100 each. Are you going to have a humongous sample? Probably not. I always have fun with this one. See, how do you test the brakes on a car? Crash test. And there are people that get paid for this. They're called crash test dummies. Or are they not real people? Crash test dummies. You guys have ever seen one in slow motion? Yeah, they're mannequins. They're dummies. Because what they do is they're filled with sensors all over their body so they can see what is the damage, head injury, body injury. But that's what crash test dummies literally are. There was a band back in the 90s. I still think it's one of the greatest things that they were the crash test dummies. They sang that song called I've tried to find it on YouTube, but I don't know how to spell it because it's just Anyway, you can only test the brakes on a car by crashing the car. Do you see a problem with that in the big picture? That's really expensive. So we want to test the brakes on the brand new Lamborghinis.
Oh no.
I have a basic problem because I have to sacrifice a lot of money, so I cannot do a very big sample, can I? But I think that was in your stomach. She's just really hungry. So the problem sometimes we have is a large sample may not be attainable. And there's a whole nother level of statistics for what happens if you can't have a large sample. Or there are things like, for example, terminal illnesses or rare diseases, and I want to study them. I might not be able to have a big sample because if it's a rare disease, it means not very many people have it. So sometimes you can't have a big sample. It's just not possible. And so the statistics that go with that situation is very, very different from what we learn. There's the hardest class at San Diego State when I was going there for grad school for stats. It's called non-parametric statistical equations. It's the one that the stats grads avoid because it's an elective. And I took that class and it was very interesting. I learned a lot. It's basically the mathematics of the unusual, the extremes. There aren't very many. A rare disease, for example. How do you have a large sample? You can't. Hardly anybody has it. Or the crash testing the brakes on the Lamborghini. How do you do things when you don't have a normal population and you don't have large samples? This is easy, and this is not expensive. But like I said, let's just pretend that it was expensive. Then I couldn't have a large sample. So now here's the issue. Here's the issue we have. Let's say you truly believe, for whatever reason, you're the consumer advocate. You truly believe that Sprouts is not, they're not consistent. But this didn't work. So you go out and you now collect a bigger sample. And now you collected a bigger sample and you got this number. Now you got it. First of all, is that done very often? No. Why? Because one of the things we've discussed in the past, how big a sample do you take? We have said the biggest one you can take. Remember, time and money. You don't take a sample, you don't spend a lot of money to do a sample and you got this result. Okay, I'm going to do it again, just make it a much bigger sample, because you would have made it a much bigger sample the first time. First of all, you have to understand, this is considered a bit unethical. If I said, I'm now going to do it again, but I'm going to take a bigger sample because I want to nail you. Well, you should have taken a bigger sample the first time, because now you're wasting time and money all over the place because you might still not be able to reject it. Now, this does happen in real life, but it doesn't happen in this situation. Okay, I've read situations. I'm caught up with a wonder drug, and I cannot just sell that wonder drug. No, the FDA has to approve it. So, every time a drug is released, a new pharmaceutical is released, it has been tested. Usually, like 10 years, it's been tested. So when it's released, okay, it's probably safe, it's okay. But the thing is if it's iffy, if it's a close call, they want to err on the side of protecting the public. So it has to, if that wonder drug is going to work, it's got to be really effective, because again, potential side effects and things like that. Okay. How many have ever heard of cyclamates? Cyclamates are an artificial sweetener. In the 1960s, that was pretty much all artificial sweeteners in the world where they used something called cyclamates. And a lot of testing, and they found out that cyclamates caused cancer in laboratory rats. And by the way, I'm pretty sure that everything causes cancer in laboratory rats, because in my lifetime, laboratory rats, I think, are born with cancer sometimes. I always tell people air causes cancer in laboratory rats, but it was banned from the United States, and it was replaced with something. Saccharin. You know what saccharin is? The pink stuff. By the way, saccharin is not legal in any country outside the United States.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's one of the most dangerous legal substances. Around 1980, saccharin, it was found to be too dangerous and cause cancer and blah, 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 blah. And it was banned for a very short period of time. It was banned in the United States. It was banned. And then the producers of saccharin said, hey, wait a minute, we would like to see the test results. And this is exactly what happened. They did tests. The tests, it wasn't bad enough. So they kept testing it until they could get enough to where they could now ban it. But that's kind of like in a court of law, you cannot be tried for the same crime twice. You've heard of that?
Yes.
There's an expression for that. Double jeopardy. Yeah, it's called double indemnity, but yeah, it's called double jeopardy. If you didn't find them guilty the first time, you don't get to keep doing it until you find them guilty. So saccharin, it was overturned. Now saccharin can never be banned. By the way, it's banned in every other country because it's deemed, by the way, cyclamates are legal in essentially every other country because they screwed it up. So saccharin, the deal was they simply have to put a warning label. Now, is the warning label on the bag? No, it's probably on the box. And it says, this substance has been known to cause cancer in laboratory animals. Do not take if you are pregnant or nursing, blah, blah, blah. Comes with a whole list of things. Does that sound familiar?
That's a Taco Bell.
It's like cigarettes.
Yeah.
But cigarettes have the same kind of a warning, don't they? Cigarettes are bad for you, and they put a warning on there, but you're going to choose to do it anyway. And by the way, you should have that right to choose that because you're not harming anybody else, but yourself, yeah. But saccharin, they messed up because they did exactly what Lila said. Well, if I just do it again, I might be able to, but it doesn't work that way in real life, especially when you came out and they jumped the gun. They kind of fudged it. And I remember just like, wow, I didn't even know that could happen. So something is coming out on the market and you'd like to know if it's safe or not safe. And so you want to test it. But, to test something to see if it's safe or not, that's kind of tricky because we generally don't do human trials. Do you understand? We don't do human trials. There is one exception. And this is, by the way, ethics are actually very important in this part of the world. That's why we do testing on rats. It's funny, I say this jokingly. I don't know if you're a PETA person or not, but PETA is always protecting all the animals on planet Earth. The only animals PETA doesn't protect are rodents. It's totally okay with PETA to exterminate all the rodents on Earth, but don't ever do anything mean to a dog or a cat but rodents, yeah, we can. I just find that ironic. They're out there to the ethical treatment of animals, as long as they're not rodents. Yeah, nobody has a problem with but the idea being, I want to test something. okay? And it's something I want dangerous, maybe to humans. We tested on the lab rats because their central nervous system is, some of you may remember high school biology, the central nervous system of the rat is closer to a human than almost any animal. That's why they do the rats, because the results on the rats often mimic what a human would go through. That, in other words, there's science behind that. It's not just that the lab folks hate rats. It's not that at all, okay? I've come up with something that I believe is a cancer treatment that's highly effective. That can only be tested on who? Very specifically, humans with cancer. Humans in maybe the late stages of cancer. Okay, so a typical trial will look like this. You've heard the term clinical trials. What that means is I have a group of people, volunteers. Half of them will get the treatment. Half of them will get what's called a placebo. Do you know what a placebo is? What that means? It's fake. Yeah, I give you something that you believe is the treatment, but it's not. And then what we do is we step back and we say, let's look at the groups and see the differences. Now, we do know this, that no matter what the situation is, if you have a placebo, there's a high percentage of people that automatically will see improvement because they believe they're going to improve. And by the way, that is powerful. Your mind is a very powerful tool. So if I give this to the group, and the placebo group, I see some improvement, but the actual group, I see huge improvement, then that's evidence to me that this is really working. Okay, first of all, now you all have terminal cancer. There's an ethical problem here. The people that get the placebo are going to die really soon of the terminal cancer. They're not going to be healed because they didn't get the treatment. So when we do clinical trials of this nature, we don't often do the placebo one because of the fact that we're basically condemning the other group. Oh. Now, how do you measure the effectiveness? Does everybody know how you measure the effectiveness of, and by the way, there are things like this all the time, life-saving drugs, but you have to volunteer, but we gave it to you. So you've been given, usually it's something like this, you've been given 6 months or less. Okay, you're in the later stages of something. So we give you the treatment. Are you going to be cured? Probably not. How do we know if it's effective? You were given 6 months or less to live. How do we know if the treatment is effective?
You live longer.
You live longer. Maybe you live 2 years. Maybe you live 3 years. You've got an extra amount of time that you probably wouldn't have had. That's how we deem whether it's effective. So because we gave it to people who were already dying of cancer, these people already know I'm going to die of cancer. I will be happy to be part of this clinical trial because I might live a little longer as a result. Maybe you didn't live any longer. Then we'd say it's probably not effective. So what if we deem it as effective? So then we wait for people to be in the final stages of their life in cancer? No, we give it to people at the beginning. Does that make sense? That's where the role of statistics is so important in reality. Pharmaceuticals use statistics more than any other thing in the world because that's how we test things. It's always based on statistical data and statistical evidence. And so we want to get it right. We're not trying to nail somebody for lying. We're actually trying to see if something's effective. It's in a much more positive note. When I was doing my graduate work at State a few years ago in statistics, they would have like job fairs occasionally, like once a semester. And all of the companies that came for the job fairs, every one of them was a pharmaceutical. And there would be a couple that like the credit report people, they were also there. You know, what is Experian and there's 3 of them, I can't remember. Yeah. There's, I get email, I get Equifax. I belong to Experian. I actually get regular updates from Experian. They always say, check all 3 of your credit reports. They're all the same. If there's something bad, they all have it. If it's good, they all have it. But that was the only other company that was actually looking to hire people coming out of school, but it was all pharmaceuticals because they want to make sure to get it right. Pharmaceuticals are a lot of money. Okay, so we want to get our conclusions right. So let's take a short break because then I want to do some problems. Last day, it took us longer to get through, so we didn't have as much time to work on the quiz problems. I would like to spend a little longer today on those because I think you guys can get all of these right 100% of the time. But you got to sit down and do it. I had a conversation yesterday with some of my students. We were talking about transferability of STEM classes, and I asked how many of you guys had labs during the pandemic, and most of them, I said, how many had online labs? And all of them raised their hand. I said, well, you know, those aren't going to transfer to anyone on planet Earth. Except at the very beginning of the pandemic. After that, nobody's accepting online labs. A typical lab was this. The chemistry professor did the entire experiment, videotaped it, you watched it, and then you wrote up the lab report. You wrote up the lab report on the perfectly performed experiment. So did you learn a lot about the lab experiment? And they're like, why wouldn't you? I watched Michael Jordan his whole career. So therefore I can do everything he does. I've watched Tiger Woods, by the way. I can do everything he does because I watched something done perfectly. I've watched Tom Brady throw a football for 20 years. So therefore I can do it perfectly because I watched somebody else do it perfectly and it made sense to me. You guys get what I'm after? You can't watch somebody else do something and expect that you're going to get it. You can't watch me do it and say, oh, I've got it. You got to try it, right? You don't know if you got it until you do it. So, Roz, you rejoice when you get the right answer on the calculator because you go, I got it. I'm going to get the right answer, and that doesn't help you. You've got to actually do it to know if you can do it. So let's take 5 minutes of set up situation. Pause and tell me. Yeah. Roz, stop withholding things from me.
My gosh.
Okay, let me get it all to the top. So at least the first two should be relatively simple because we just did this problem, didn't we? What's the difference here? Bags of cement, bags of potatoes. Mm-hmm. I'm not making smushed cement later though. I am making smushed potatoes tonight. Smushed cement is not very tasty, just so you know. I've been there, done that. Okay. So this should feel very familiar. Okay. Again, I'm not picking on Home Depot, just so you guys know. I use Home Depot all the time. It's the only place I know to get stuff like this. So I didn't want to make up a store name. I was watching a movie the other day, Denzel Washington. He does the it's not the Punisher, it's the is it the Equalizer? It's something like that. I think it's called the Equalizer. He plays like a former Black Ops, government guy, and he's working at a Home Depot. Mm-hmm. And it's Home Depot. Everything about it's Home Depot, even their outfits. And then I realized later they called it Home Mart in the movie. Because if they'd called it Home Depot, they wouldn't have gotten sued. They would have had to pay Home Depot a lot of money to use their name, so they just called it Home Mart. And I just thought it was funny because even the aprons they were wearing were Home Depot, even had the Home Depot logo. It just said Home Mart on it. I just thought that was kind of funny that they changed the name, so that way, they something different. So this is, has anybody ever actually purchased cement at Home Depot? I actually have. What do you remember anything about when you bought the bags?
They're heavy and big.
And there's cement everywhere, isn't there?
All over there. Right?
There's always cement all over the floor. Why? Because these big, heavy bags, these 50-pound bags of cement are wrapped with paper.
Really thin one too. It's a pretty.
And it's paper that's sturdy enough to hold the bag when it's not moving, but because people are moving them, a lot of the bags have small holes and tears in them, and there's cement on the ground at all times. That's one of the main reasons the bags may not weigh actually 50 pounds. Oh, but do you understand? That's actually really a realistic situation. Is there a lot of cement on the ground? Well, if you've ever been there, yeah, there's a lot of cement on the ground, but it's not from one bag. It's from many, many, many bags. So I always pick up the bag, I move it around, I see if anything's coming out of it.
Depends on the floor.
And by the way, if I hold the bag and I see a tiny leak, I'm not buying that bag. I'm buying the bags that don't have leaks. They're probably going to weigh 50. But what I don't have at Home Depot that I do at Sprouts, I don't have a little scale there to weigh the bag to see what's 50 pounds. Yeah, not Z, no? There's no such thing as a test on Z. What are you testing? Yeah, you're calculating Z. Yeah, Z being 50 and not 50 wouldn't make a lot of sense. That's Z. This is Z, well, we call it Z star. So what's your rejection criteria? Yeah, you've got to switch. So that should be a Z. We're calling Z star the measured Z because the other Z is the Z you're looking up. And you don't have to call it Z star. I just think it's less confusing because one's the line in the sand and the other is the calculation. They're two different things, right? I'm measuring my calculation against the line in the sand. So I said, let's call the calculation Z star. Now, what picture do you have?
It's the 2.5 on each side.
So we call that a two-tailed test. And it's very important because if you don't realize it's a two-tailed test, you might not realize there's two rejection criteria. Okay, so now what is this equal? That's your Z. So we'll call it Z star. Okay, so what does that mean to you? Is that extreme?
No. Yes.
Well, did you write down your criteria for rejection? This is where drawing the picture I think is useful. You never have to, you just always should. What does your picture look like? So you said, what is this value here? What's the left?
Negative 2.5.
And what's the right value? Positive. So if my Z is any number between these two, I'm not going to reject. But if I'm in either one of these tails, I will reject. So are you in one of the tails? Which tail are you in, left or right? So are you in the shark infested lava? Yeah, in this case though, there's shark infested lava on both sides of the road. So now if you're in the shark infested lava, it's not a question of degree. You're never barely guilty. And therefore, yes, so now you can calculate.
Can I say question 4? I don't actually have the paper in front of me.
Well, that's why. Okay, so everybody got the null and alternative?
If you can check mine too. Yes.
Next one is, it's always the same order. After you calculate your Z, now you can make a conclusion. So now, yeah, so everything's here is great. So these should be the same. That should be 2576 also.
Oh, what did I do?
You looked up two different numbers. That's just crazy.
I know.
Crazy. Okay.
Other than that, I'm set up.
The order is always the same. You can't state your conclusion until you've done your calculation. And remember, all conclusions are either reject the null, fail to reject the null. That's the first half of your conclusion. You're either going to reject the null or you're going to fail to reject the null. Then the second half is, what is the truth? So when you reject the null, then the alternative is the truth. When you fail to reject the null, more often than not, you're going to say there's not enough evidence. That's most of the time what you're going to say. No, you're not saying why you reject it. You're saying if I reject the null, what am I saying is the truth? That the bags are empty. You're saying I'm going to reject the null, the bags are 50 pounds. Or fail to reject the null, there's not enough evidence to conclude the bags are 50 pounds. Do you understand? Those are the only two possibilities. And you don't use an opinion, you use the number you calculate. Perfect. Is that a simple thing to say? This is, now the last thing, when I say state your conclusion, I literally mean you're holding a press conference, you're going to tell the world your results, so use words that everybody understands. Don't use lawyer speak. And as much as I say that, I'll have students, they'll write a paragraph and I still can't, do you want to go to the prom with me? Shouldn't it have to be yes or no? There shouldn't be like a paragraph of explanation and at the end I go, I don't know if that's a yes or no. Did you reject it? Did you fail to reject it? I can't tell because there's so much explanation. I have fun with this, but I have students who just, they want to explain when it's a yes or no.
Okay, just for this one, this is what is that my N?
And that's your X.
And that's your X bar?
And so, no, that's number of successes. This is just on P, there's no X bar. That's so.
I wouldn't know.
Yeah, but everything has been recorded, so you can't really watch the lectures. Watch the lectures?
No, I work till midnight or sleep all day.
Well, if you're not going to watch the lecture, I can't help you because I am recording them. All right, so there's a conclusion for the obvious. Now, the last piece is the p-value. Now, you remember what the p-value means? P-value is, what is the probability? Now this one you're just going to pull out your Z table. What's the probability of a result this extreme or more? But remember on the two-tailed, it's in either direction. So when you look up that number, this is the one you double because it's two-tailed. So if I said, let's just say hypothetically, you found a result that's 3 standard deviations away from the mean. Well, what's the probability of being that extreme or more in either direction is the whole point. Oh, so I take one of them and I two-tails, I double it. You only double it on the two-tail test. But you're looking up this number, you're not calculating this number. So whatever you got, and like I think Raj, you pointed this out last week, the p-value makes it really easy. If your level of significance is a number, it's either going to be 0.5 or 0.1. If your p-value is smaller than that, then you reject the null every time.
I don't know if this is right. I calculated it tight.
What'd you get?
0.
That's because you put 50 minus 50 on the top.
What's wrong?
Shouldn't it be that number minus 50?
Oh, okay.
Oh, you've got.
I asked you, did I set that
Oh.
right? So I thought.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're pointing to the. You haven't.
I meant the whole thing.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was looking at your denominator.
I'm sorry.
No,
Okay.
your n is 50. I'm sorry. Your n is 88.
Oh.
You've got all your numbers switched. Your n is 88.
Okay.
Your x bar is 49, and your s is. Where's s? Your s is this.
Oh.
Yeah, you got them kind of all.
Sorry.
Oh,
So,
jeez, man.
These
I
numbers.
gotta redo all this.
Yeah, you've got.
Okay.
Yeah, let's redo that part. Look at the last example we did.
I did.
The potatoes. Now, is that number really small? Now, how did you get that? And since it's two-tailed, you actually double that number.
What?
This comes from last week's lecture. We talked about 2 times that. So if I think about it in terms of a picture, if I said in a two-tailed test, what's the probability of being this extreme or more in either direction? Oh, and you calculate that one, and then I double it. You need a calculator? Or 2 times. So just write 2 times that. 2 times.
I don't know if
So how are we doing?
Not too bad.
So that over. Now what's s?
Oh, no,
That.
that is on the table.
And then over the square root of n, which is that.
Okay.
There we go. The reason you were getting 0 mainly is because you were using mu for x bar and mu for mu. And you're using the same number. Now, this number is very far from 50. But it might be because my sample is so huge,
I got it.
it might be too far.
Okay.
And this is the whole idea of there's always cement on the floor, but all the bags are leaking. In this case, yes. In all of the other problems, there was one tail, then you just do it. Again, the simplest way to think of a p-value, and many stats courses, they use only the p-value. In other words, the criteria for rejection that we said, they only use the p-value. It's real simple. If my alpha is 0.05, if my p is less than 0.05, I've already rejected it. If it's greater, I failed to. That's an easy way to think about it. Yes. And if my p-value, no matter what, if my p-value is smaller than alpha, you always rejected it. And that's how you kind of a confirmation that you did it right. Now, the other thing about p-value is, if p is really, 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 really small, then you go, you know what? That result is totally extreme. I'm good. What if p is really big? We did one with Robert. Remember last day we talked about, and we got a really big p-value. Remember making the dummies cry?
Oh,
We got a really large p-value. Which, if your p-value is really large, then you're saying, you know what? That null hypothesis is totally reasonable as the truth. I have no problem with saying that's the truth. So that's the other thing about p. If p is really big, it lends more credence that the null is true. You fail when the p is bigger than the alpha. You fail to reject. But do you ever say the null is actually the truth? That's like saying, do you ever say you're innocent? Well, what if my 50-pound bags of cement came in literally all at 50 pounds? Then wouldn't we say the null is the truth? That's probably not going to happen, but.
My typing is correct, or like,
Which one? Well, this is not a test on p. This is a test on mu.
Well,
That's p was last.
no, I'm talking about the second problem. The quiz.
On this quiz or the one from last time?
No, this one.
Well,
Sorry.
there's no probability on this quiz.
Oh, man. What is that?
Are you talking about this problem here?
Yeah.
There's no probabilities. These are X bars and mu's.
Oh, so the P, oh, no.
P value is something you're looking at the Z
Why
test.
does it say mean twice? It's two different, it was 50 and it was.
I'm sorry.
Oh, it's not.
Oh.
Oh.
That's it.
All right. This is a good one. This is something that does happen. How do you know how do we know if the students at our school are better than other schools, the same as other schools, or worse than other schools? How would we know that? Well, if we had a national test, by the way, you all did this in high school, okay? Do you remember taking standardized tests in high school? At the high school, usually you did one every year. My son has one coming up next week. He's a senior, and it's called CAST, C-A-S-T. They used to call them SAT, Stanford Aptitude. Not the one you do for college, but the one K through 11, literally they would do this every year. And what the test would measure was how are you versus all of the other kids in the United States? You guys know what I'm talking about? You took these tests every single year. Basically, it was to see, are you learning what we need you to learn? So you took a test that measured you versus everyone else. So how can a school say they are particularly good or particularly bad or particularly average? Is how do their students stack up versus the rest of the world? Okay, so I'm saying, here's a standardized test, a national standardized test that everybody's taking. And that's the national mean. That's the mu. Now, here at Mesa College, we had a whole bunch of students take that same test and they scored this. Can we say we are significantly higher than the national average? Or is it turned out, is that just a blip and maybe we're very average? I don't know. That's our X bar, that's the mu, that's actually sigma because it's the national, and that's our N. We have everything sitting right there. Except this time, it's going to be a one-tailed test.
The only reason I was confused is because the word mean was used twice. So
yes.
I see mean, I mean mu. So
well, but X bar is the sample mean, mu is the population mean. So here I'm telling you the population mean is 91.4, and I'm telling you Mason's sample mean.
X bar is 91.4.
No.
So, what?
The entire world had an average of 91.4. That would be mu.
Okay. So
Mesa College had an average of 95.7.
So
that can't be mu. That's got to be X bar.
Is 95.
Yeah. So is 95.7 far enough above 91.4 that we can say that we are truly above average? We don't know. We have to calculate the Z. So what is your? We're trying to prove we're better.
So it would be greater than.
So this is got to be a little bit careful. We have to prove we're better. We don't start by assuming we're better. See, if the school says we're better than everyone else, what should your first response be? Prove it. Oh, so we don't assume the greater than. We assume that we're not better, which would mean my no would be less than or equal. And I must make the evidence show that we're better. Does that make sense?
So it's less than or equal or greater than?
Greater
Good. No. If you start by assuming we're greater than or equal, then it means we don't have to prove it.
So what are we looking for?
And we have mu.
I'm so I get it.
I see what you mean. I see what you mean.
So it would be that.
This is the easiest problem you have. You don't have to do anything.
I'm confused.
You've given you X bar, N, and sigma. We're trying to determine if Mesa College is better than the national average or not better than the national average.
91.4 or
That's what I'm trying to figure out. That's the claim that Mesa students are
greater than.
Exactly. Perfect. Now, it's the thing. So, but put our X bars bigger, but it could be one of those things where, one person took the test and they scored above average, but the next one might score below average. Might score average.
No, it's less better.
So we need to prove that we're better. We can't start by assuming we're better. We have to prove we're better. So the assumption should be we're less than equal. In other words, what's not better? Less than equal. That's why it's a little bit tricky at first. You go, oh, Andrea says, I can jump higher than any of you. Or I can run faster than any of you. So we don't start by assuming that's true. We say, prove it. So let's start by assuming you're not faster than any of us. Does that mean you're exactly the same? Well, it also could mean you're less. That's why we start. Why would that confuse you? I keep saying the same thing.
I'm lost on number 6. I don't even know where we're going. Good.
Okay, I'll say it one more time.
Mu.
We have to prove we're
That's what I'm
bigger.
asking. If we're measuring mu.
We're doing, no, you're doing whether, so
Whether
you're
Mesa
either, you're either less than or equal to.
Mesa's mu.
Okay.
Mesa's mu.
Can you? So, I know it's.
So draw the picture. Draw the picture.
I know it's 2.57.
It's not. Draw the picture. The bag's not even close. Yeah, you're not using this number.
What am I using then?
No, you aren't using this number.
No.
I'm saying use this number.
Oh, I was doing 0.0. I added another 0 word.
Yeah, yeah. Remember the magic numbers use the same ones over and over and over and over again. But draw. This is a one-tailed test. It's a one-tailed test. So what's going to cause rejection? The right tail or the left tail? Yes. Right. Right. So that's why I always say draw it. Sketch, shade the right.
Greater than, C is greater than 1.6.
Yes. And if my calculation comes out bigger than that, we're saying that's convincing evidence to say makes it better than the rest of the world. Does that make sense? And if it's not bigger, we can say, well, our sample was good, but it's not enough. It's not convincing. Remember, beyond reasonable doubt, it's convincing evidence.
Okay.
So now, does everybody understand? That's the criteria for rejection. If I meet the criteria for rejection, my conclusion is makes it is better than the rest of the country. If I don't reach the criteria for the rejection, our conclusion is there's not enough evidence to say we're better. But my sample was so good, but that's not enough. You've got to calculate a z-score and show that. Now, I'm a little biased. I think we're better. But the sample has to, you know.
I'm still on this.
Well, this is two things.
Yes, I'm done with this one, but
What's the null isn't a number. Reject the null. The bags don't weigh 50 pounds. The null is a statement. The null is a statement that the bags average is 50. No, the average is not 50 pounds. Mu. Look at your saying mu is 50 or mu is not 50. If you're rejecting the null, then your conclusion should be that. Reject the null, the mean is not 50 pounds. Yeah, or you can say the bags don't weigh 50 pounds on average.
I like that.
That's probably a better
Yeah.
Because when you're giving information to another stats person, you say, oh, mu is not 50. They know what you're saying. If you're talking to your husband and say, oh, mu is not 50, he look at you like you're completely nuts. But what does that mean? Oh, the bags don't weigh 50 pounds.
And then the p-value. Okay, so I did what you said.
Now the p-value is you just look up in your z-table.
Okay, I did. Okay.
Sure, but you're really comparing it to this.
Number 6.
Okay.
Either way, bigger, whether round or
I don't know what
Exactly.
that number
No, I'm still gonna
Number
So what's the
6.
conclusion?
reject.
No, that's
Second
not
page, number 6.
This is bigger than this, so we're good.
Oh, this one? The Mesa one?
And but if you want to convince yourself, say this. Therefore, that's not right. And what is your? Remember, the conclusion is reject the null.
Oh, this
State the
one.
truth, or fail to reject the null. State the truth. There's always a follow-up to reject and fail to reject. So.
I know. I mean,
That looks good.
get help from that.
No, Mesa students.
Test scores are above.
Or just Mesa students are, but yeah, how you could say some wording.
Because it's a standardized test.
Yes.
But I guess I could have just.
Oh, but then
I'm
you
so
got-
confused. So ignore the.
Yeah, 1.7, because when you look up in the table, you can only use 2, so just use the 1.
No.
What you wrote is perfect. But now when I look up the p-value, I can't really use that
0.7,
third.
so it's 0.0.
That's negative 1.7.
That goes
I want it to be bigger than the positive.
down here.
So
Oh.
it's gonna be,
5.4.
but that, but that's not that. So no, here, if I look up this number, I'm gonna get that. Oh, I want 1 minus that p. That's, remember, the numbers are always to the left.
That.
Well, I can try.
So just put
Is
it
that
down.
the right one?
Yes.
What's your
No, this one.
Well, what's your alpha?
It's 0.05, right?
0.05.
So look that up.
And it's
what's
1
your
tail.
rank?
So what's your magic number?
2.576. I got it now.
Oh, wait.
Professor.
Now, this is smaller than alpha. Therefore, you reject it. That's the p-value is like the ultimate confirmation that you made the right choice. This is smaller than alpha. You reject it. If this was smaller than alpha, you failed to reject. Or vice versa, you say that something was terribly wrong.
Wait, I could pick up that.
Oh, good. Makes it easier on me. Okay, so no.
61.
The null has to always include the other way.
For
No, the null hypothesis is something is equal, it's greater than or equal, it's less than or equal. But the equal has to go with the null. We have to prove Mason is smart.
oh yeah.
We don't assume Mason is smart. Oh, so if I'm assuming we're not smarter, that means we're either the same or less.
Oh.
Right? How can, if you're not better, that means you're the same or worse. So what's my null? The same or worse, so less than.
So is it
Okay, now you got it backwards again. And why would your mu be 05? It's 91.4 is the national mu. We're trying to determine if Mesa is above average or not. The national average is 91.4. Are we better than 91.4 or are we not better than 91.4?
that would that be?
State the criteria for rejecting.
So this one
Draw your picture. What are we trying to prove? We're trying to if we're better or not better. So we have to be really good to feel better. So right there. What's your alternative?
This is not your alternative.
Your alternative is bigger or smaller? Your alternative is bigger, so I will only reject. No.
Oh, okay. And then the opposite. Oh, that's it. I'm trying to do too much.
If you reject for less, then you're saying we could score 0.
I can do the right.
No, we got to be really good.
Thank you.
So that right there, is that right there, and that means also your rejection criteria.
Okay. But
Exactly. These three things.
so, and then when you set
Does
this
that make
up,
sense? Now, what if my sample is out here, then it's a no-brainer. I reject, we are better. But if my numbers come in,
okay,
you're saying, you know what, I'm better. That's the failed rejection. You might be guilty, but that's not the
plug in the numbers.
Yeah, 95.7
minus 91.
So what do you say?
Divided by 19.7
over the square root of.
Got it. Okay.
How you state your final conclusions should usually be in similar words to what you're testing. We're trying to determine if Lisa is better than the national.
Yep, I'm gonna take a break after this semester of that.
Well, what math do you still have to take?
I don't know.
Oh.
And we
So the one thing about math is you don't want to take that up too long of a break because you lose skills.
I'll focus on English now.
What are you thinking about studying?
I'm in child development. I want to become a.
So you're going to probably have to take a math 210A and B or no? That's elementary math. I don't know for child development. All right, I'm going to stop the recording because I think we
Are you
can,
taking us out?
no,
Okay.
no, it's just that this has been recording all this time, but I don't think we need to record it anymore.